Okay, good evening. The meeting of the Planning Commission will come to order. Will everybody please rise and follow Commissioner Owens in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Ready? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty.
Thank you. Will the secretary please call roll?
Vice Chairman Duarte.
Present.
Commissioner Frometta.
Present.
Commissioner Spathopoulos.
Present.
Chairman Dominguez is absent, and Chair Owens. I'm sorry, Patrick. Commissioner Owens.
Present.
There you go. Okay. Will those in the audience please read the cover page of the agenda as it outlines the procedures which the commission will follow. This is the time set aside for oral communications for the Planning Commission. Does any commissioner wish to express any announcement or report on a conference or a meeting or request items for a future agenda? Commissioner Frometta?
None.
Mr. Owens?
None, thank you.
None.
Okay. And none for me. Is the Director of Community Development aware of any presentations for tonight?
Yes, Vice Chair Duarte, we do have a presentation tonight. Tonight we have our consultant, Julie Dixon, providing a presentation on a one-year assessment for our parking study for our downtown area. Julie will give some comprehensive detail in terms of what that assessment includes. In short, I'd say about a year and a half ago, the Planning Commission received a presentation on a comprehensive parking assessment that we did for downtown. One of the recommendations that we've implemented is to come back on an annual basis for 5 years to continually assess the parking rates in our downtown. As the Planning Commission has seen, we've approved a lot of new development for our downtown, both retail and residential. So we want to make sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves in terms of development versus the accessible parking that we have on the public side. So not the private side, just what we have in terms of our public assets that are being utilized out there on street and off street. And so tonight I'll introduce Julie Dixon, and she can talk about who she is, her efforts, and what we have in front of us.
Thank you, Aldo. Thank you again for having us. It's nice to see some familiar faces. And for those of you who we haven't met before, my name is Julie Dixon with Dixon Resources Unlimited. Make sure, perfect, there we go. So as Aldo mentioned, we actually began the parking roadmap for Downey back in 2015. And after doing that initial project where we collected an abundance of data, we also developed a parking roadmap for the city of Downey. And as Aldo mentioned, the city has established an agreement where we come back every year and do data collection. Before I go into some of the data collection and analysis, I'd like to just share a little bit about our background as a parking and transportation consulting firm. And I had the opportunity to speak with staff right before today's meeting to just talk about some of the innovations and some of the developments that is actually happening in our industry, which I think you'll see is somewhat impactful here in Downey as well. So we provide parking and transportation consulting services across the country, and we're able to work with programs of all shapes and sizes. And so being able to see the effects of the docked bike programs, rideshare programs, and looking at communities like yours that utilize time limits versus paid parking, locations that have a parking garage like yours, and really being able to see the overall effects of what that is in your community is really what we're going to talk about tonight. I actually also have a couple of my colleagues in the audience here behind me as well, just because of the fact that they also helped with the report and analysis. So tonight we're excited to provide this kind of ongoing check the temperature status of what's happening in Downey. And I can't emphasize enough what Aldo talked about is the fact that the city has invested in this annual assessment, I think is really important when you talk about the development opportunities that are coming into the city, is so that we're continuing to monitor the effects and what that is doing to parking in the downtown community so that we can make sure that your strategic alignment with policies and regulations are really teed up and that you're in that place and process where you can make effective decisions moving forward. And I think that that is something that is very refreshing, that the city is taking such a proactive stance towards that. Oftentimes we get called into programs after kind of the barn door is already open and the problem is so significant that you really are trying to kind of herd cats to try to improve the problem. And so it's really nice to be in advance of this growth opportunity so that we really can monitor and manage and make really effective decisions moving forward. So with that, I will begin to share some of the results of the data collection that occurred. We actually collected the data in September, and it was really important that we maintain consistency of our last data collection that we did back in 2015 so that the data was after the summer break, the students are back in school, there wasn't an impactful holiday weekend or anything like that. We also tried to make sure that the normal conditions were on a weekday where it isn't impacted by street sweeping or trash pickup. Same with on a Saturday, is that we try to follow that same consistent pattern of data collection from what we did back in 2015 to what we did back in this fall in September. And when we come back this coming year in 2019, we'll find those same parameters so that we come back in September, identify that weekday, either a Tuesday or a Thursday typically, and then that Saturday, which we'll share that data here as well. So the other piece that I think is really effective when we talk about especially, you know, we read a lot about smart cities and how are we going to manage the curb moving forward. And so when you have a city making data-driven decisions, this is really important because oftentimes when we deal with parking programs, we deal with the perception of parking and the fact that there's no parking available or I can't park exactly where I want to park. And so to be able to have this type of data is going to be very relevant as you move forward and consider new developments and what the impacts of those are going to be. There's a lot of things happening in our industry when it comes to things like parking minimums and parking ratios. So to be able to have this data is going to allow yourselves and just city administration to be able to make those types of effective decisions. On the right side of the screen, you'll actually see the highlighted areas that were actually studied. You can see that it's really that Downey Avenue core and the surrounding parking lots and some of the surrounding streets. And as you go through the area, we're going to talk about the importance of on and off street of the data that resulted in the counts. We actually utilized a data collection company called NDS that actually counted the cars for us. And they also did something that we call a utilization study. Utilization is very important when we talk about a community like yours because utilization identifies how long the car is actually parking for. And that's something important when we talk about time limits. Is that are the cars parking for beyond the posted time limits? How long are they actually staying for? And that's a specific way that we actually like to monitor the parking utilization in a community like yours so that we really can see what the effects are. Now, before we start to get into the data, there's one thing I want to highlight, and it's something called the 85% mark. And for those of you that have been aware of parking, and you've probably heard of Dr. Donald Shoup, there's a theory that if your street is occupied at 85%, basically you're at that full mark when you need to start considering other actions that you need to take or other policies that you need to change. When you're at 85%, it's basically you have maybe 1 or 2 parking spaces available in a block face, or in a parking lot, you know, roughly a handful of spaces available. When you start to hit 85%, it's when you need to start thinking about things that you need to do to change your policies or adjustments that you need to make, maybe introducing paid parking, things like that that need to be considered when you get into that path. And what we're going to share tonight are the results so that when you think about that 85% mark, it'll be something to be aware of. The data was basically collected during 4 time frames, 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. And in this case, we were out on Tuesday, September 18th. And it was selected because it didn't interfere with trash pickup or street sweeping. And we also came out during the same time frames and collected data on Saturday, September 22nd. So what I highlighted again was about the fact of utilization. That's how we're able to manage and monitor the turnover. And that's going to be something when we talk about how long the cars are parking for. That'll be very relevant when we get to that specific slide and talking about the actual length of stay. So we want to make sure for this next 5 years that we continue to collect under these same parameters so that when we're making comparisons, we really can have those comparable measures when we talk about the numbers moving forward. So getting into your on-street occupancy, we tried to really simplify the data. I know there's a lot of numbers up there, but what you can see on the left column are all of the streets that were calculated, again, within that mapped zone within the core of the downtown. The second column over is the inventory of parking spaces that are on street. Luckily enough, many of your on-street spaces actually have markings like T-bars or angle parking spaces, so it makes it a lot simpler to be able to count the cars. And as you move over onto the right columns, you'll see the time of day for the data collection and basically the percentage of spaces that were occupied during that data collection period. Along the bottom column, you can see the total percent, what of the average usage of those spaces were by time of day. And going across that board for the current average occupancy, you can see that on the weekdays, your average occupancy is 31% on street and 42% on street for the weekends. Now I highlight this because when we talk about the occupancy for 85%, you can see that you're well below the threshold. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight is I've had the opportunity to spend some quality time in Downey. And one of the things that I think is important is I have never had a challenge finding a parking space. Now, mind you, I might not be able to park on the 100 block of Downey Avenue to go run in to grab my sandwich. I might have to actually go 1 block over or go to the parking garage. And I think that that's really important when you talk about the industry standard from surveyed folks is that they tend to say I'd like to park within a block or two of a space. But I also like to emphasize, and this was something that came out very prevalently in our previous study, was you have a very walkable downtown. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I was actually really pleased on returning to Downey, just the aesthetic improvements too that I think have been made to the downtown core. I visit a lot of downtowns, and I have to tell you from just a personal perspective, I find Downey to be a very pleasant downtown, a very walkable downtown, and the fact that I can find parking so easily, I think is something that is a message that has to really carry through. Now again, when we talk about that issue of perception, and the fact that, sure, that real core right there at Firestone and Downey Avenue, there's congestion there, right? Because people see the destination that they want to go to and they just want to find a parking space. We'll talk about some of the recommendations that come out of this, including wayfinding, that I think can help improve that. But when you look at the numbers, you can see relatively consistent from what the averages were to what they are today from 2015 to now. Now, some of you might ask, well, what's up with the decrease? Why do we see a slightly lower number? Now, without having, specific details about this to be able to speak to, I can just talk about industry trends. And one of the industry trends that we see that is really affecting occupancy is rideshare. We find that a significant number of folks, especially when they're coming to the downtown core, they're actually utilizing rideshare and alternative forms of transportation. So I can't speak to that being the exact reason or cause here in Downey, but I would reflect based on my experience that that's likely why we see a slight decrease in occupancy. But again, the fact that we see the vibrant nature of our downtown retail and shops and businesses, and seeing the fact that we do have consistent traffic, I think it speaks a lot to your community. Now, very important too, when you look at New Street, having the highest combined weekday and weekend average at 9 a.m., I think that there's a couple of factors that we have to consider with that. In a moment when we talk about off-street, we're going to talk about the farmers market and the effects that the farmers market does have. But overall, the fact is that consistently across the board, there is availability for parking in your on-street locations. And no surprise, Downey Avenue has the highest combined average for all of the remaining time periods. And even just today when I pulled into town, I drove down Downey Avenue, and having the folks that were waiting for those primo parking spaces, I think, again, that's a positive for a community like yours, because people are coming to your downtown. And the fact is that unlike or like other communities, they want to park right in front of the establishment that they want to head towards. Now for on-street turnover, this is where the utilization data comes into play, where the reason why we capture the license plates is you can see really where the majority of the people, for how long they're parking. Now you can see that on the weekdays and on the weekends, the average is basically consistent with the fact that you have about 82% of the vehicles that are basically parking for a 3-hour stay. And consistently, you see the number is really relevant for both the weekdays and the weekends, that the number really, again, remains consistent, that your average stay for people that are parking in your on-street locations are tending to stay for about 3 hours, and that on Downey Avenue, the 3-hour turnover was really, again, the highest rate and the highest location where you saw that. Now, we're not here to talk about enforcement, but when you talk about your posted time limits, the fact that people are staying for more than 3 hours, I can make an observation of the fact that we probably don't have consistent enforcement, or we potentially don't have enough enforcement resources. I like to put that out there, because when we see the fact that, again, most of the cars are there for more than 3 hours, there's probably something that we can connect there. But again, we're not here to make those assumptions, but I can sit here and make the observations based on the data. But again, I'm sure everybody can share that number as well. And then on 4th Street, again, the highest percentage of the 9 and 12 o'clock hour turnover on the weekdays and weekends. For off-street occupancy, now whenever we basically have numbers that are in, well, in this case it's a light shade of pink, but it's probably more in the red side on the handout, that's when we obviously have concern. But I want to highlight, when we talk about pinch points, and even in the areas where we have some yellow for areas to be aware of, you'll notice that the pinch point on the weekend in the narrow lot is really that accessible parking near the farmer's market, and that's really where you have that density. People want to park, they know it's there, it's easy to get to the farmer's market and out. But when you look at the rest of the day on Saturday, you see the blip in the drop in the numbers, and it really doesn't have that big of an effect. But I always like to highlight the fact, when you only have one red hotspot, that's actually a good thing, because it means people are coming to your farmer's market. And when you look at the density of the surrounding areas, and you can see where you have kind of that 50% mark, all within walking distance of the farmer's market. So for me, that shows that the farmer's market, popular location, people like to come to it, and that 97%. The one thing that we can talk about is addressing it through wayfinding and making sure that people are aware of alternative locations, and really putting that message out there in the literature and marketing of the farmer's market to identify where we want people to park, and that really comes into that marketing and outreach. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight is when we talk about the Civic Center parking lot, and you look at it during the weekdays, and the library parking lot, I don't think it comes as any surprise to us to see the occupancy rates where they are, because I think we all understand that the parking experience is different at those locations as compared to what it is in your downtown area. The folks that maybe are coming here to go to the library to study, or to go hear a lecture, or the folks that are coming to work at City Hall, or potentially come in and go through the permitting process, or whatever the case may be. But again, for those numbers and the amount of occupancy and availability, the density being in the weekday morning, it's not anything that I think draws any kind of concern, because of the fact that there's still plenty of parking availability out there, and you don't really have that density in the core of downtown. So when you really look at these numbers, the fact is that there's nothing that really brings concern, but it's an awareness so that as we monitor this moving forward. Now, the one point that I highlighted to staff when we talk about the Civic Center lot in particular, now this might encourage us to say maybe we need to look at some carpooling programs, or van pools or things like that, that we might be able to promote alternatives for staff that may be driving to work, so that we could maybe look at a way to try to potentially offset any employee parking that's happening in that area. But again, it's one of those things to be proactive and to be able to respond rather than to react to those numbers. Now for the off-street turnover rates, similar as before, we captured the license plates to really show how long the vehicles were basically staying for. And you can see, with the exception of the Civic Center lot, the majority of the vehicles turned over within the 3 hours. And so when you look through those numbers overall and you see the average again, from the weekday to the weekend, you can see that that 70 and 75% ratio, the numbers really kind of across the board are very much consistent, but now there is that one slight increase compared to the on-street on that 6 hour mark for the weekday. So when you really kind of talk about your laborers or your employees that are potentially working in your downtown core as well, that might also be the reason for that increase. Now, the one thing that we did not do when we were capturing the license plates, we did not demark if somebody had a parking permit. So when you look at the folks that maybe did stay for the 6 hour parking or longer, they could have had a parking permit. So there's nothing necessarily illegal or in violation per se of this, but they could have been parking per regulation, but highlighting the fact that, again, kind of in that weekend and even the weekday and even the weekend, those could be the folks that are working and have parking permits and are allowed to park in those locations. And one thing I do want to highlight about off-street, and just because I would be doing a disservice if I didn't highlight this, just like the 85% mark, it's very important when we talk about parking management. You typically want to encourage the longer term parkers to park in the off-street locations. So it's really important when we talk about, as you're considering changes or, as the downtown develops further, the things that we want to do is promote the longer term parking in the off-street locations. You always want to make the premium on-street parking where you manage your time limits and really manage that compliance aspect and enforcement. That's really what you want to focus for the on-street, and the off-street is where we put the long-term parking. So now I might have slowed my clicker here. There we go. So in conclusion, and the recommendations. So right now you're well below the targets for the industry standards for the 85% mark. And when we start to talk about the fact that the majority of the spaces were turning over for that 3 hour mark, again, a little bit of a flag for what we need to do to maybe beef up or boost up enforcement. When we look at the Downey Avenue, the fact that some of the block faces exceeded 85%, but I have to reinforce, when we did the original parking study, we talked about the Downey Avenue block that's right there off of Firestone. Considering the opportunity to decrease the time limit at that location, we still back that recommendation and think that that would be wise. Or you could consider the potential of repurposing curb space like that for rideshare pickup and drop off, or as we call it, active passenger pickup and drop off. That's something that we've been doing very consistently in other communities, is the utilization of active pickup and drop off zones. It really helps mitigate traffic congestion and also improves the safety of the passenger pickup and drop off zones. Another thing I'd like to mention about the 3 hour time limit, something else that's been very prevalent in other communities that we've worked in, we've introduced a no reparking ordinance so that the municipal ordinances are actually updated to prevent people from reparking in the time limited zones. It basically prevents your downtown employees or business owners from hopscotching parking spaces or rubbing the chalk marks off of tires. So it's another thing that can be considered, again, moving forward as we continue to manage and monitor the data. For the narrow lot in particular, but really talking about the farmers market in general, and again, overall for the downtown, that investment in wayfinding we think would be very much advantageous for the downtown. There have been several innovations since we've been here last time, some very cost-effective technology solutions that I think would be very beneficial for the city to consider as you all pursue wayfinding opportunities. And in the Civic Center a lot, again, It's expected to have seen the numbers that we saw there because of the folks that are parking. But again, to be able to promote alternatives, carpooling, and other incentive programs to motivate our employees to take alternative modes or car sharing, I think would be advantageous for the city to consider. And with that, I just would like to thank you again for the opportunity to provide this information. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will look forward to being able to present this information again as the city continues to grow.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions, Commissioner Fermenta?
No questions.
Commissioner Owens?
Just one. So the cutoff on all the study was at around 6 p.m. Why wouldn't we go, 7, 8, 9? I know extend your day, but why wouldn't we look at it during those times too?
It's actually a really great idea considering the nightlife and the expanding utilization in downtown. I would say that would absolutely be worth considering for the next time that we do it. I think that from the previous study to where you are today, it's actually an exciting time. I know I get excited about things, but the fact that the community is growing and the fact that you are having the utilization of your restaurants and the bars at nighttime, so I think that's a great consideration for next year for sure. So
Great. Yes, because as I've sat here for a short amount of time on this commission, certainly we've had projects come in front of us that are going to, open up one day, and that's going to put a real, additional pressure. So I think it's my observation at night, 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, it's full tilt. So that's something that I think we may look at in the next round like you had suggested.
Definitely, and I also want to highlight with wayfinding and the utilization of the garage, the fact that you have that just invaluable asset right there in the core of downtown is also an opportunity that to this day I have not seen the parking garage full, and so to be able to know that there's fair assumptions that could be made based on the utilization that you have, that being able to utilize that asset. But I absolutely agree, the data collection would be another data point, especially as the again, the expanse of your utilization downtown would be great.
And I'm sure you're working with staff. I pick up on the point about the mention of wayfinding. Great idea. It's done everywhere, worldwide.
Definitely.
Why not here?
Absolutely.
It would help. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Spatos?
No questions.
I just had a few. Just in terms of the term, when you say smart cities, you talked about that earlier. What do you mean by that? And is Downey, are we on the verge of that, or what are we doing for that?
Yeah, no, smart cities, it's kind of one of those catchphrases, right, that's being spoken about. Same with the term curb management. Those are all terms that are really kind of bantied about. And when we talk about smart cities, from my perspective, it's cities that are looking at innovative ways to manage challenges, using technology to try to manage solutions. And a great example would be the docked bike program that just recently launched. That's a great example of a smart city solution, way that you can offset emissions and introduce, innovation by trying to reduce single occupancy vehicle rides. So there's opportunities even just with the bus lines that are running through the community that are using the messaging boards that talk about the availability of the bus or when the bus is going to be coming next. Those are all things that when you talk about the use of technology to promote solutions, and a great example would be when you all consider the wayfinding opportunities to be able to share information electronically, to mapping programs and things like that. Those are some of the things that you would talk about being smart city solutions. This is very basic, but your parking enforcement officers just over this last year or so converted to handheld technology. So the handhelds going from the old school paper ticket book to handhelds. Those handhelds actually offer a lot of innovation. So when you talk about smart cities, it's really about utilizing technology to help manage solutions.
Okay, great. And I was also just going to echo what Commissioner Owens talked about, potentially just moving this maybe also to include 9 p.m. Just because I know we have a busy downtown, and
Sure.
there's also people get out a little later than 6 p.m. for work. But I think that's probably the one thing I'd like to see expanded on this.
We'll make a note of that for next year for sure.
And I have no further questions.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Julie.
So are we able to comments or queries of staff on this item? I have, some related questions.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe Ms. Dixon can help in that matter, but no, for the moment, yeah, please. I'm still curious about the second story of the Porto's parking structure and its use, certainly controlled by Porto's. We don't have any privilege to that. There's no plan to ever have privilege to that as public
That's correct.
parking. So, and I've never been to the top, obviously, because we don't have access, but is it full? Do we know?
Well, you know what? I couldn't speak to certainty on that. I know they park a lot of their staff up there. Also, in addition to the Porto's restaurant, they also provide that to the businesses that lease from their office structure.
Okay, the old Cardona building.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
All right.
So from their perspective, they're leased at capacity on that parking there. So they need every space there. Hindsight's 2020. They initially wanted, I believe, a 4-story parking structure there when they came out of the ground, and people balked at that. So once again, if that was 4 stories today, you'd probably have some public interaction with usage on that site.
Okay, and as Ms. Dixon had pointed out, as I use Downey Avenue as a travel route, not necessarily intended for that, the street is wearing and tearing because of that, but I do notice that there are people who are probably parked longer than the 2 hours, which the study shows, to run into a Porto's, to even sit down and have a meal, not necessarily stand in line, to get a purchase accomplished. So I'm sure you're considering additional enforcement when available, as available, with our parking enforcement forces. How big of an impact, if we reduce that to 1 hour? I remember that, I was actually on the Public Works Commission at the time when we discussed the 20-minute parking versus the 2 hours in certain spots there, the shoe store, the real estate office, the dry cleaner, and so on and so on. But in your opinion, though, to take another swipe at this and go 1 hour in those spots, will we pick up additional enforcement maybe to make that happen?
Well, you're exactly right. One of the recommendations, a couple of the recommendations of the study we were able to implement is, Ms. Dixon mentioned, one of them was to go from paper to handheld ticket writers for the enforcement officers, so we were able to implement that. The other was the addition of a parking enforcement officer for the city to include the downtown. So the police department was able to add that as well. One of the things that we're going to do also is to talk to our police department and share this study and talk about what some next steps are. I know that the police department met with the business owners of the downtown approximately 3 years ago. It was probably about a year to 18 months out in front of when we did the study. And they initially thought the same thing, that we'd like turnover. We'd want more turnover in front of our storefronts, but don't ticket my customers, and I want to park in front of my storefront.
Sure.
So it went from 1 hour to 3 hours to back to where it's at 2 hours. But as you're suggesting, it is a topic that we should revisit on a regular basis to see if sentiment changes based on usage and what's happening out there. And then also now the new development is we now have a Downtown Downey Improvement Association that's run by the property owners. So now we've got another stakeholder involved in that. We invited them to this meeting. We sent them the agenda and the parking study. We're going to send them as well. So we're going to engage them too to see what ideas they have. So Porto's is the driving force in that association, so we're going to talk to them as well. One of the things that we'd asked Porto's in the past that feeds into what you had mentioned is, hey, you folks close rather early for our downtown, and that's fine. That's their business model. Well, how about opening up the structure after you close? They're hesitant based on a lot of the liability issues and so forth, but it's a topic worth revisiting again to try to open up the amount of access and spaces that we have down there. So all of those themes are something that we're going to revisit on an annual basis, and this report provides that springboard to get out in front of folks to continually look at that.
Thank you. And then one last comment I would ask Vice Chair Duarte. So down at your end of the block where you do business, is there an impact? Do you realize an impact during your day, with people staying too long or the turnover's good? I know you get to park, in your dedicated spot, so you're not impacted, but how about the spaces in front of you? What happens there?
I actually have gotten a ticket. So, and, right in front of my office now, it's pretty much empty because there has been enforcement. It actually was a lot of business owners. We were parking in the front. We have parking spots in the back. They're a little tighter, but I have seen, with some enforcement, I have seen it a little lighter traffic. I wasn't trying to pay a ticket twice, so with that, but I have seen with enforcement some change.
Okay. Yeah, because again, with this, the developments that we have seen here lately that are, in process, I'm sure you're going to get slammed at some point down at that end of the block as well.
Yeah, and I think the big key is enforcement. Every time you see somebody walking right past your office, you just see people just start moving. So.
Right. And we've done a thorough assessment of our downtown, particularly to who our largest landowners are. And so the largest landowner down there is a church. Mm-hmm. And, they have off-peak usage for their lot. We've continued to approach them, and we just haven't gotten to a point where we can negotiate shared usage of their lots. We're going to continue to do so. We have other churches that allow off-site shared parking agreements with some of our businesses as well. Some of those have been approved by this body in the past. So we're with you in terms of what are the assets out there, whether they be publicly or privately owned, and how can we share based on our peak hours? And we're going to continue to try to move in that direction. There's also some thought about creating some shared pickup locations in our downtown. And so once again, we're going to continue to revisit those concepts as we continue to grow.
For Uber and Lyft. Yeah.
I have a comment / question. Maybe Ms. Dixon can help us. How do we address the valet situation? I think Mr. Owens mentioned something that was very important, starting a study after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. And where do those valet, whether they're restaurants or businesses, where do they go? What structure do they use? Is it the parking garage? Is it off-street parking? And will that be addressed if we are considering doing an after-hour study?
Well, we currently now allow valet through a conditional use permit that has to be approved by this body. And the reason being is we want to make sure that it operates correctly. And by operates correctly, we immediately default to how many hours are they working at the valet booth and so forth. But for us, what we're more concerned about is the traffic pattern and the traffic circulation plan that a valet presents to us, because we want to make sure that they're going to be able to get into and not disrupt the flow of traffic or parking in that immediate area. The only and most recent valet service that we saw was with the approval of the Mi Cielo restaurant that's now, BRB. At that site. And so they provided a transportation circulation plan based on their valet service that was tenuous at first, and we continually needed to work that out with them, also based on where their off-site parking was. In terms of the distance, that's up to them in terms of their client base and how quick they're going to get cars back and how quick their valets are actually going to run in terms of to that spot to get those cars back. Also, we've also considered our public assets and where they're the higher usership is and where the lower usership is to see where those spots are available. Because we would be open to getting into partnerships and or contractual agreements with private users to use our lots on off-peak periods if we had the ability to do so. We've also talked to numerous businesses and property owners about a shared valet parking system. And it's, what comes, the cart before the horse, what comes first? Do you need the large influx of patrons and successful businesses, or do you need to plan for those? And that's where businesses get on the fence. We envisioned a few of our most busiest retailers or restaurants and approached them and envisioned a shared valet service, but we're not there yet. Because we think we can carve out space either on Downey or 2nd Street to put that type of shared location. But at the end of the day, they have got to pay into it. They've got to pay the valet service. They've got to make sure that somebody's gleaming a profit and that it's beneficial to those businesses. We've talked to the local valet services as well, and they're interested, once again, if they can make something work with those businesses. And it's also with need, because something interesting also with BRB, They thought their valet was going to be a jewel of their service, and it hasn't been. It goes back to what Ms. Dixon said. They're seeing more ride sharing to their locations, so they're seeing less of a need for valet. And to them right now, it's turning into more of a cost burden than a profit. And that's a recent experience with that single user. And we may see more of that in the future, or it may start to level out. But we are giving it high consideration that when new uses come in to start talking about those shared uses. When the Avenue Theater adaptive reuse application came in, we tried to push them as hard as we could to do a shared valet with the other folks down the streets. Now, we can't manage personalities, business relationships, or even competing interest, but we pushed that when their application first came in. And it's not something that we can mandate, unfortunately, but it's, hey, look, let's take a step back. And if you're doing a Google Earth view of the downtown, you know, where those shared assets are, you've got common peak usages, where can we share in those types of burdens, one being parking, one being traffic circulation, and so forth. So it's something that we're going to continue to push, something that we've discussed with our Downtown Downey Improvement Association, so that they could start to think about it as well, so that we can get some energy behind it.
I have a question. I know we're talking about the parking and time frame and of that parking, and possibly being more stringent. How would that affect the businesses in that area?
Well,
Has that been studied?
Well, it hasn't been studied, but they pitched them before. As I mentioned, the police department went out there approximately 3 years ago, and they were all over the place. The majority of them don't want to decrease the amount of parking time that's allowed out there. So their sweet spot is 2 hours, because we pitched the 1 hour, and then they pitched the 3 hours, and then they came back with the 2 hours. That's why you have the 2 hours now. I think what's important is that we continue to revisit that on a regular basis. You might have turnover. You might have an experience, as Planning Commissioner Duarte mentioned, as being a retail user out there, that trends might start to change. Enforcement, maybe through better wayfinding signage, people are using off-site parking resources more, so you start to free up area. So what's important, I think, is that we continue to research it as we start to evolve.
Very good.
Yeah, you might be able to buy a pair of shoes in 1 hour, but my wife, no way.
I had a question also. You know, Ms. Dixon, she mentioned Professor Shoup.
Yep.
And I got to see a presentation from him 2 years ago.
Yep.
Very entertaining.
Yeah.
Been those breakout sessions, there was also talked about no parking concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, I think Riverside, they were downtown.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they were going with.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that we would possibly see in downtown?
No. No, it's too cutting edge for us. Santa Monica is doing the same thing. And, you know, we've also talked here about a residential parking, and where very, very progressive communities are headed, and Downey's not there.
Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much.
And folks, just to be clear, so tonight's presentation is a receive and file. There's no action required. Once again, it's an exercise to keep the Planning Commission abreast of our study and our activities and efforts with parking downtown.
Okay. Next on our agenda is a report on city council actions.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair. Oh, we got it right. Duarte. And at the last council meeting, the City Council heard a public hearing on the opening of the Community Development Block Grant and Home Investment Funding Cycle. It was the opening of requesting solicitations. Staff will be conducting at least 3 different community meetings to try to hear from the community in terms of some funding interest that they may have. And then in May of this year, staff will come back to City Council to present those funding recommendations. The council also approved a self-move/relocation agreement with the American Legion Hall, Hollydale Post 723. That's that property on the corner of Garfield and Gardendale. Owned by the county, leased by the American Legion, slated to be redeveloped for affordable housing for veterans. Not homeless housing or a homeless shelter, but affordable housing for veterans. And lastly, the City Council approved a purchase and sale agreement for that sliver of right-of-way on the southwest corner of Lakewood Imperial. The Planning Commission prior to that had approved the land use was compatible for that site for an improved retail development at that site. And that concludes council action.
Thank you. And I see that sliver is going to be used for
Approve the whole.
what's the it's, Chick-fil-A, right?
Well, you know, the newspaper got ahead of all of us. The Planning Commission needs to approve that site plan. And so, you know, rumors fly pretty quickly. We can't manage those, but, you know, that's the Chick-fil-A has submitted an application, but you know what? We don't comment on that until they get out of entitlements and the Planning Commission here, you know, slams that gavel on approving that.
All right.
Yeah, we need to find the leak. On the Hollydale Park, you know, as social media, you know, does what it does, those residents over there in Hollydale are really tore up.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate their concern, but they really have no way in.
Oh, they
Yeah, it's Downey property.
They do have a weigh-in in that the city council is going to hear their concerns in terms of what their view is. Also, what's really interesting, and I've seen this for the first time in my career, is that the county is going to require any developer that's chosen to build that site to do a very, very robust outreach to that community. So there'll be numerous community meetings through different stages of that pre-development so that the residents there at least understand and or are brought into the loop of that. I don't think I wasn't here, and I don't believe our present commission was around. I think Yvette might have been here when the Downey View was built in our downtown. So that may have been a 4-1 or a 3-2 vote on that. And what we see in this business is that it takes about 2 years for people to understand that an affordable housing complex isn't going to bring blight, isn't going to reduce their property values, and usually looks really damn good. The only request that we get about the Downey View, or even how should I say, questions are there units available? You know, how do I get in there? Because it looks like a pristine market rate product, and that's what the majority of product that we've seen in the surrounding areas it looks like. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to management. It's not putting your clothes out on the balconies, not putting your cars on cinder blocks. All of that stuff. You get quality management of those types of developments, and they don't look any different than market rate. And so I'm confident as well that once that site is built out, it's going to take a bit of time because residents are critical of government and what they're told, for them to realize that it's a good-looking building, but now it's operated in a fashion that's not going to affect them, their housing or their property values.
You absolutely nailed it. You know, the sentiment that's out on the internet,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in regards to the two sides of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Living here my whole life, I mean, we had a affectionate handle for that part of town. It was basically Mayberry. So, although it's Hollydale, but you know, quaint little horse property and some other things over there. But I would agree. You know, this view project, you know, is an upgrade. You know, it's really, really nice. And the other projects that have come in front of this commission for downtown housing have turned out as good, if not better, you know, in their aesthetics. So I think it would really improve, you know, that park, you know, in its current state. You know, I don't know where you're going to drink once the bar is gone, but there's probably some places in Hollydale or whatever. But thank you.
Okay. And I'm seeing there's no public hearings set for today.
No public hearings.
Okay, so now on to non-agenda public comment. Does anybody in the audience want to come on up and speak? No, seeing none. We go on to the consent calendar. We have. So each item will be acted on in a motion unless commissioner requests a separate action. Anyone wishing to discuss a consent calendar item should be recognized by the chairman. State your name, address, and agenda item. Do I have a motion to approve the consent calendar as is?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Yeah, we need some abstentions from some of these items, correctly?
The minutes for,
Mm-hmm. Correct.
From Etta says
You're on there, yeah.
What day was it?
2018, though.
Oh, no, I wasn't here on January 18th.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll have to take it,
Abstain from that one.
Sure. To a future
we'll
meeting.
have to move it unless, let's see,
There's
hold
no
on.
quorum.
Yeah, we'll have to move it to when the chairman gets back. So, next meeting. January 16th,
About the
2019.
approval minutes of January 16th? We had it here.
Yeah, motion to approve the January 16, 2019 minutes.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. And now the,
We have to play, excuse me. Okay, can you place your vote? The vote is now open. Oh, you have to point it here, sorry. Okay, the motion passes to approve the minutes of the January 16th, 2019 meeting with Commissioner Spathopoulos abstaining and Chair Dominguez absent.
and also now line item number 4, PLN -19-0027, zoning text and amendment.
I'll make a motion to approve that.
Do we have a second?
Second?
Thank you, Commissioner.
Vote is now open. The motion passes to approve PLN 19-00027 zoning text amendment initiation with a vote of 4 in favor and Chair Dominguez absent.
Okay. Now on to other business. Does anybody have any new business, or does any commissioner have any business to discuss?
I have just one follow-up. I think I saw striping at the Starbucks. So thank you very much.
Sure.
And certainly the antenna's gone from the old McDonald's rooftop.
Sure.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Staff member comments?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Duarte. I'd sent an email out last week. This Monday, we have our CEQA EIR scoping meeting in regards to the specific plan for the future light rail station over in the Rancho South campus off of Gardendale. And as mentioned previously, staff is working on a specific plan, and that's to lay out the land uses around that anticipated light rail station. And one of the requirements under the California Environmental Quality Act is to have a scoping meeting. A scoping meeting is different than a community meeting. It's literally you're taking testimony. You want to hear what people's comments are so that you could put them into the administrative record of that environmental impact report. So it's not going to be a touchy-feely breakout, communicate about what's going there and what needs are. It's going to be more of a structured meeting. We are going to communicate that on a couple different occasions to the people that attend. We are going to have presentations by Metro so they can talk about their plan with light rail on that station and in the area. The county will also be there to chat about their expansion plans on that site. The area is owned by the county. And so, once again, if you folks have some time, feel free to join us at that meeting as well. And then on a lighter note, Black Bear Diner is going into the former Caro's site on Florence, and they have a ribbon cutting on March 21st at 11 a.m. So feel free to join us as well.
All right. Okay, so I think with that, the meeting is adjourned.